Well, welcome everyone. My name is Troy Lanigan. I'm president of the Canada Strong and Free Network. Welcome to September's Exchange call. First and foremost, we could not do these without sponsorship, so a very special thank you to our sponsor, the Modern Miracle Network. Couple of housekeeping matters and announcements. First of all, we are going to let the chat function run today with the usual reminder that we will remove anyone posting rude or objectionable comments. The chat is for commentary and networking. There should be a drop-down box in the chat if you wanted to reach out to someone that made a comment that was of interest to you. The Q&A box at the bottom of your screen is for questions. The moderator will only be looking at the Q&A box for questions, not into the chat. So please put those there if you wish them to be acknowledged. This Zoom call will be recorded and we'll post it on our website about 2 hours after the call today. If you have any suggestions on future topics, please connect through our website or email me directly at troy@canadastrongandfree.network. Speaking of other topics, before we get started, I just want to do a plug. We have our regional networking conference coming up next Saturday, October 1st. Was scheduled to be in Alberta, but because of the new COVID restrictions there, we've had to make the decision yesterday to move it online. Our keynote speaker is US talk show host Dennis Prager, but probably best known for his online venture, PragerU. It's just $50 for the day, but if you use the code EXCHANGE, you can take 25% off. I'll ask Zoe to put that registration link into the chat right now. Also, one day earlier on October 1st, in conjunction with the Manning Foundation, we'll be hosting our third Best Practices Forum. This event will also be online. Best practice forums are for conservative and free market practitioners. We have discussions about fundraising, list building, communications. It's not a discussion of public policy issues. There's no charge for this event, but attendance is by application or invitation only. Again, I'll ask Zoe to put that into the chat box for you. Okay, we're here to talk about all things election and where conservatives go from here. We have a great panel of familiar faces. With a special welcome to Alexandre, who is from Quebec and joining us for the first time on an exchange call. Thank you for joining us. Before I hand it over to Kate, I'll share one little stat. Blacklock's Reporter, our friend's great publication. I read yesterday, Trudeau with 32% of the vote. That is the lowest electoral support for a sitting prime minister since the country was founded in 1867. So there's a little stat to chew on. The first time in history, a prime minister is a prime minister with less than 1/3 of the vote. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kate Harrison. Thanks, Kate, for moderating today. As always, great to see you. And I'll turn it over to you for our discussion for the next hour.
Wonderful. Thanks very much for that, Troy. And a good piece of context as we dive into a discussion on not just the election, but the state of the conservative movement. You look at the popular vote increase, or the popular vote number, excuse me, and there's something to get excited about there for a lot of conservatives. Obviously, there is a challenge with efficiency. So this was an election that nobody really wanted. Nothing really changed, but there's now a lot to talk about in terms of where the movement goes from here, what we're feeling good about, what needs a little bit of work. And before I introduce the panelists, I just want to set the stage by saying this is not an election postmortem. This is not going to be a conversation about whether or not leadership of the Conservative Party should change or stay the same. This is going to be a conversation very much about issues, health of the movement, obviously some really great things to point to at the provincial level recently in terms of the election of a Conservative government in Nova Scotia, and now 8 out of 10 provinces being led by at least small c Conservative leaders. So this is a conversation about the health of the movement and all those things. So joining me today is Ginny Roth. She is the National Practice Lead for Government Relations at Crestview Strategy. We have Jordan Bateman, who is the Vice President of Communications at ICBA and also a contributor to the Orca, a very good publication in BC for those that are interested in some center-right BC perspective, longtime observer of BC politics. Danielle Smith, of course, president of the Alberta Enterprise Group, and as Troy noted, Alexandre Médéressian, sorry, that's me pretending to be French, who is managing director at Teneo. So with that, I'd like to begin the conversation by looking at glass half full. What was good? What was the positive that you saw come out of this campaign? I think a lot of folks, based on even just the attendance of today's session, conservatives are probably feeling a little bit bruised about how things went on Monday night. And I think it's always good to begin on a more positive note. So perhaps we can start, why don't we go west to east for this one? Jordan, maybe you want to get the ball rolling. What's your takeaway of something that worked well over the course of the last 36 days?
Well, in British Columbia, the Conservatives lost ground, so it's hard to say anything was great. I would say this, it feels like the key stars within the Conservative Party, for the most part, all won re-election. So, you're not starting from scratch at introducing people to, Canadians at large. A lot of their energy folks, the folks that really kind of pushed that party forward, were re-elected. So, that's I guess a positive sign. One thing I actually really liked with the campaign was Aaron O'Toole's use of the studio. Now, I know that you prefer to have leaders out there connecting with people. I did think the studio approach was a way to reach out to a bunch more people in a COVID setting safely, and certainly numbers far outweighed or transcended the other parties. So I think there's something there. But those would be kind of my two, I guess, very thin glimmers of silver lining in this one.
Alex, what about yourself from a Quebec perspective?
Well, look, I mean, from a Quebec perspective, it was a decent and frankly a positive election from our point of view, because the expectations were so low, right? People outside of Quebec don't understand the damage of the 2019 campaign. The 2019 campaign by Andrew Scheer was absolutely horrible in Quebec. And what Aaron and the campaign successfully did is they rebuilt that damage, not for this election cycle, but maybe for the next one. Quebec, in order to win votes, people have to listen to you. Aaron was entering this election with nobody wanting to listen to him. And towards the end, people were actually listening to what he had to say. And he also got François Legault's endorsement. And François Legault is an unbelievably popular premier right now. He's over 50% of the vote, which we've never seen in modern Quebec history. And so right there, it's very interesting also to see the link now, the more direct link between Quebec nationalists and the Conservative Party. And we haven't had that real conversation in a very long time. And Legault even came out saying, Quebec nationalists should support the Blues, being the Conservatives. And so that is starting. And even if we missed this cycle and we only kept the seats we had, the next cycle is going to be interesting in Quebec because the Bloc did not do well in this election. Blanchet was very far from what he was expecting, even a few days before the election, to win. He actually lost seats, which is great for us. And there's actually one seat that's still undecided in Quebec, which is Trois-Rivières, which is far away from the Quebec City area. If we end up winning that seat, that is a huge win for the Conservative Party. It opens up a huge swath of the province potentially for the next cycle. So I'm looking to the future, and I actually see this election as having been positive for us in Quebec.
Great, thank you for that. Ginny, over to you.
I think I'll kind of pick up on what Jordan was saying, which is that, I'm not a big fan of sort of promoting youth stuff for youth's sake. Kate, you and I have fought before about the youth wing of our party. But I do think that I think a party needs its young people to participate in forming its future, if it's going to have a future, just by the sheer sort of demographic reality of that. And I think when you look at not just seats that are sort of like recently changed over, but where we've had MPs retire and they've been replaced with young, new, energetic members, so Melissa Lanceman in Ontario, Adam Chambers in Ontario, Eric Duncan, who was already a sort of rising, strong young voice for the party in Ontario. I think having these faces and voices around the cabinet table, or sorry, the caucus table, sadly not the cabinet table, will help drive conversations towards the future and thinking about the fact that the millennial voting bloc is the biggest one in Canada. And, Gen Z is nipping fast at its heels. And so, I'm not saying that I'm not even saying that we should necessarily modernize. I'm purely making a demographic point about young people have to be open to voting conservative if we're going to form government, and having more young people in our caucus and driving more of the decision making and being more the public face of the party is, I think, a good thing.
Yeah, that's great. And we will spend a little bit of time talking about narrative and messaging and positioning. Already getting a number of questions about that. Question around modernity, and does that necessarily mean a tack to the center, or being seen to be a little bit more small L liberal in persuasion? But before going there, Danielle, what are your thoughts on kind of the positive takeaways out of the election?
I think Aaron O'Toole tried an interesting strategy, and it's going to be interesting to see if his party supports him in it. He campaigned as being sort of the true conservative. And even I remember his last email fundraiser was, the only thing preventing Peter MacKay from winning is me, and I'm the true conservative, and he's a red Tory, and don't vote for him. And then he tacked very much to the red Tory side. I mean, even doing of an availability with Brian Mulroney that demonstrates the kind of positioning that he wants to make for the party. And it may well be that that's what's necessary to win. I mean, I can, at the national level, I can see some positive in this, that he lost a chunk of his support by kicking out Derek Sloan. He lost a chunk of his support by failing to bring Maxime Bernier into the fold, but he pretty well made all of it up on centrist voters. And so, to Alexandra's point, that may be a positioning that allows him to win a majority government next time around. I was interested to see that the mainstream press did not seem to dogpile on him. He seemed to have an almost error-free election. Even the commentators that night said, "Oh, well, now we know him a little bit better, and he's not very scary." And so that, I think, is the issue: is that he was unknown. He's now known, and he's known to be a pretty solid personality. The other thing I'd say is positive is that, at least by talking about vaccine passports and mandatory vaccination, we weren't talking about the just transition and phasing Canada out of fossil fuels completely by 2030. And to me, that's a positive, because I think what we were worried about in Alberta is that we'd be the punching bag, and at the end, everybody would take such a hard line position against the continued transformation of energy that it would box them into a corner. They kept trying to get Jagmeet Singh to say he'd cancel Trans Mountain. He didn't. They kept trying to get Jagmeet Singh to say he wouldn't work with the Conservatives. He didn't. Kept trying to alienate the Quebec from Aaron O'Toole. It didn't work. So I think that paves the way for a lot more pragmatic discussion about how all parts of the economy, all sectors, are going to contribute to our recovery. And so I think that's a positive.
Great. You mentioned the word pragmatism, and I think that that's a good segue into a discussion around narrative and messaging, and kind of the common refrain that seems to be emerging out of this election, which was that the Conservatives ran more to the center than they have in the past. Perhaps some would say alienating part of the base in the process of doing this. I'm curious in some just your general reflections on whether or not that is a fair criticism. Are we vulnerable? And we will talk about the People's Party, but are we a bit vulnerable in that approach? Is it a gamble? Is it the one that makes sense for the movement right now? But generally, your reflections on whether or not that is a fair assessment. Did the Conservatives tax center? Is that the path that we should continue or keep pursuing? And what are the risks associated with doing that? Obviously, we saw a depressed vote in Western Canada, for instance. So Danielle, I'll stay with you, and then I'll ask a similar question to the others.
I prefer a more principled conservative approach. I prefer an approach that recognizes the libertarian wing of the conservative movement. And sadly, I'm on the losing end of that discussion, not only in my home province, but I think also nationally. So I'm prepared to lose that for a time, but not forever. And so I think that that's one of the issues that we've got to come to terms with at the federal level is, does the Alberta brand of conservatism the traditional conservative brand of conservatism, is that sellable anywhere else in the country? And if it isn't, then maybe we have to, and Troy Lanigan, I'm sure, is grinning ear to ear when I say this, maybe we have to embrace proportional representation so that we can at least cobble together the different types of conservatism that exist in different parts of the country. But obviously, progressive conservatism in Nova Scotia is very different than conservatism in Central. It's very different than conservatism in Quebec, and Western Canadian conservatism is a different animal altogether. And so maybe having a future approach where we embrace with our friends in the NDP and the Greens that perhaps having proportional representation in some measure would allow for us to cobble together enough of a majority. I think that's a better approach than continuing to alienate conservatives who are expecting something different from their leaders. And then when they end up getting milquetoast or soft liberal or red Tory, they get disappointed and then blow it all apart and go and form a new party. Maybe we just need to embrace that conservatism is different in different regions.
Kate, if I could just chime in proactively on that. First of all, I don't know that I see evidence, and I'm not saying it didn't happen. I just have yet to see any evidence that we picked up in this last election serious moderate voters who didn't vote for us in the last couple elections. Particularly, when you look at the GTA breakdowns, conservative vote share went down, liberal vote share also went down, but our share went down by more. We got fewer votes in Ontario than we did last time around. And I don't know that we can use the evidence of the media going easy on O'Toole because he's more liked by them as I don't know that we can draw a line between that and winning more moderate votes. And in fact, I think, my instincts would tell me that if our entire strategy is about being unthreatening, if I'm a potential liberal conservative swing voter, I'm just going to vote for the real deal. I'm going to vote for the party that is, has a liberal history. So I just put that out there. I don't think we know that that's an option. But I also think it's unhelpful to think about the different ideologies of the party and the sort of spectrums of them. I think it's much more useful to think about issues and posture. So I think in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, we started in a really proactive, almost aggressive stance, which I liked, with a platform that was out. We were driving the Liberals into our message box. The Liberals were responding to what O'Toole was putting out there. In the final couple of weeks of the campaign, and I think partially this is because Liberals are such strong campaigners, stronger than we give them credit for sometimes, we were in a bit of a crouch, like we were in a defensive crouch where we were responding to Liberal issues instead of raising our own. And I think that is my biggest takeaway from this past campaign and what I care about going forward. It's picking major issues and driving them so that the other parties have to respond to us. So, and not necessarily on moderate or less moderate grounds. So I think about housing, for example. The housing issue was crucial to voters in this campaign, and the party's policies were a little bit indistinguishable from one another. And yet we know as conservatives, there's a pretty clear solve, and it's, local governments need to stop interfering with planning so that more housing supply can get built. We didn't put it that way, though. We had a sort of a hodgepodge of policies in the space, kind of similar to the Liberals, a bit of supply side, a bit of demand side. If we had come out and said, we are willing to risk losing some boomer votes in exchange for a ton of millennial votes on this issue, because we're open to home prices dropping a little bit, and just breaking out of this issue and being super aggressive on it, that's an example for me of where we could get out of the crouch and into a really aggressive stance and driving the issues and building coalitions of support, not necessarily on right-left lines, but on just common sense stuff that can unite us across social conservatives and fiscal conservatives and libertarians, to Danielle's point. So I'll stop there, but I would just throw that out as a way to think about it.
Yeah, and I think it's a helpful reminder that young voters are not a monolith, and they certainly do not think about politics in the same way that I think people joining this call may, right, in terms of dividing things along ideology. Alex, what are your reflections on that? And just to the point on issues, is there anything that you feel moved the needle or could move the needle in a future election from a Quebec perspective?
So I'm going to give a true Quebec perspective, and I hope that folks in the rest of the country understand this. First of all, Quebecers don't really care about federal politics. All we do is watch what happens at l'Assemblée nationale, which is our provincial legislature. And my point in saying that is, us, the political nerds on this panel, but also the folks listening in who are passionate about this, we have to realize policy doesn't matter. No one cares about policy anymore. And this was the first real election where we're used to seeing this in the US and certain parts of Europe, where we had a cult of the personality. It was about the personalities of the leaders, because policy-wise, like Jenny was saying, there wasn't a huge difference between all of the political parties on the stage. They were all proposing carbon taxes. I know some people say, oh, well, that's what allowed Maxime Bernier. We didn't lose because of Maxime Bernier. On the contrary, Maxime Bernier is very helpful to us because he's able to take away a certain fringe of the voter base that scares off large swaths of urban Canada in Montreal and in Toronto. And so what we need to realize is how we say things is just as, if not more important than the actual policies we put forward. And I wish as a movement, we would worry more about our image. And, we laugh at Justin Trudeau for how much he cares about his image. And sometimes it is a bit ridiculous. But frankly, it really is critical. And, I live on the island of Montreal, okay? Probably the most hostile place for a conservative in this country. And my wife doesn't care about politics. Almost all my neighbors, nobody cares about politics. And what a lot of people told me about this election? They were like, Aaron O'Toole, I really like the sneakers he wears. It's cool. It's interesting. And I'm sure people at home are laughing right now. Really, sneakers? Really? Yes, it actually did matter. And it made some people listen to him. So look, Kate, I'm I'm trying to keep this answer as short as possible. But I really hope that we have a genuine conversation about how we present ourselves as a party, how our image actually matters more than ever. And policy really doesn't matter. I know I'm going full on controversial and I'm not nuancing what I'm saying, but that's the truth. And in Quebec in particular, no one cares about the federal level amongst the general population. So I hope that that's something that we learn as a movement moving forward for the next cycle.
Jordan, do you think there can be a happy marriage between policy and ideas and values and branding?
Yeah, well, I think obviously policy and ideas help bridge into your branding. Look, this campaign, the Conservative movement did not do a good job of talking about affordability. And we would kind of circle back to it once in a while, but that should have been the issue every day. Affordability, especially in suburban areas. Number one. Number two, we didn't talk about integrity that much. Here's a prime minister who has had multiple scandals. When you start rolling out a campaign and the media were suspicious of his motives from the start, that's the time to start rolling out the scandal of the day. Even if it's an old scandal, just reminding people, hey, remember when he did this? Remember when he went to the island? Remember when he, put himself ahead of you? And just starting to dim that brand a bit. We got to be honest here. Like, we're at 34% of the vote. We're stalled out. We're slightly down from last time. We have fewer seats than last time. We can't pretend that what we did worked. And so we have to have the honest conversations and about everything from the leader on down to that branding. I do think the image thing is important. My daughter is 18. This was her first election. I am 99.999% sure she voted for Jagmeet Singh. And which is fine because I'm in a riding that splits the vote, so it all works out. It's like a vote for the Conservatives, don't tell her. But he connected with her generation of university students in a way that we didn't. Now, take a look at the Angus Reid polls right before the vote. The Conservatives actually had a plurality among young voters because the Liberals and the Greens and the NDP split it so economically for us. But these are, we've got to figure out ways to, not just the young, but do I feel like I know Aaron O'Toole a little bit better than I did before? Yeah, I guess, he looked like Mr. Clean on the cover of the platform. Alexander tells me he had great sneakers. I didn't really notice, but, we do have to figure out whoever the leader is, if it's O'Toole or someone else, you've got to start introducing them sooner than later. If you're going to make the change, make it sooner than later. And start building that image brand out immediately.
It's a good opportunity to talk a bit about the floor that we find ourselves in and that growth. And I'd like to get your thoughts on where that potential lies to grow. We've heard a little bit about maybe that's issues driven, maybe that's driven by a little bit more focus on image. We obviously have seen that work with the Prime Minister, focusing on the latter as opposed to the former. Any of you want to weigh in on kind of how we can, where we should be focused very specifically, ideally on increasing that floor and how to move it? Danielle, you made a reference to electoral reform as a way to do that, or perhaps to better reflect the actual outcomes that we are getting. Where should the focus be for you? Is it, you know, more minority outreach? Is it young voters, as Ginny has alluded to?
I think there's 4 areas, and I've talked about this before, that I think are really important. Municipal is front of mind because we're going to have a municipal election in Alberta province-wide in a month's time, and incidentally, a vote on equalization, which I just put it on the radar because I suspect it's going to be pretty overwhelmingly in favor of removing the principle of equalization from the Constitution, which should start a national discussion. But I think what we do as Conservatives is we allow the left to take over the municipal councils, and then what happens? They get profile, and then what happens? Well, then they're able to get elected at the provincial and federal level. But worse than that, our guys are all brand new. They're unknown quantities. And so they get defined by the single posting that they made on Facebook 10 years ago. We need to be more active in municipal politics, if only to get some experience, but also I think because it becomes a training ground for higher levels of office. And I think the left uses that well, and I think we're terrible at it. Second area is with our students. We've got to get trades education in all of our schools across the country, because guess what? When kids get trained in trades and they have practical skills, then they go out and think, hey, maybe I want to be a business owner. Maybe I want to be an entrepreneur, as opposed to maybe I want to be a social justice warrior. So I think we need to double down on trades education, which also lends itself to embracing our friends in the blue collar trades. Why in the world would anyone vote for the NDP if they're a blue collar resource sector trade unionist? They should be on our side. I interviewed Jerry Diaz, and I cannot understand why he continues to support the Liberals. He should be foursquare behind the Conservatives. And we've mismanaged that relationship with our blue collar workers. We need to bring them into the fold. And then the last area, of course, is the environment. I'm firmly of the view that Alberta, with a hydrogen policy, with a net zero policy using carbon capture, utilization and storage, small scale nuclear, geothermal, I am convinced we will be net zero in our province faster than anybody else. And that's the kind of message that we need to lead with as well. We need to take that off the table so people can see all the good things that we're doing, and so that our young people will take a closer look at our party. So those are the 4 areas where I think we need to spend some effort.
Jordan, what do you think about that? And then we'll go to Ginny and Alex.
Well, Danielle's group and our group have been talking about trades for a while now, so amen to that. There's a lot. You're exactly right. Like, you know, we don't do a great job at equipping the young within the party, within society at large. You know, I was a 29-year-old city councillor in a very conservative riding. I'd served 2 terms. I never ever received, even when I reached out to the sitting conservative government here, you know, for some advice on certain issues that were bubbling up at the council table, never received any advice or direction on, you know, what, you know, some talking points would be. Like, we do a terrible job of resourcing those folks. So, you know, those few, you know, conservative folks who do get elected to municipal councils, you know, we basically just throw them in the deep end and then ignore them for 3 or 4 years, depending on how long their term is, and then wonder why they don't get reelected, or wonder why they're so jaded with the movement going forward. So, you know, it is a weakness that we have to correct. We have got to find, we have to, you know, in business, we talk a lot about succession planning. You know, you always make sure that, you know, you have someone who can kind of step in to run the place, but also to do the frontline work. You know, you have a plan for worst case scenarios. We don't do that on our side of the movement in politics. We don't have those succession plans for candidates, for campaign managers, and for that apparatus that we need. And until we get serious about investing in that, we're going to lose a lot more elections than we win.
Ginny, what do you think in terms of focus on how to broaden the tent and grow it, and where should we be trying to place more of an effort on the voters that we attract?
I mean, I come back to first principles. I think we get so freaked out sometimes after we lose elections, and I'll come back to this crouch kind of analogy, I think we have to like make sure we get out of that crouch. And it's not by being like hardline right wingers. It's by talking about personal and religious freedoms, which we know 80% of our movement agrees on. Like, what are the things that we know a huge percentage of our movement agrees on? Personal and religious freedoms, you know, good governance and sound financial management at the highest level, personal affordability, cost of living, housing. You don't even have to be a social conservative to care about family formation, big, good, strong families. These are all sort of like big, broad themes that we can all get behind, that if we talk about them in real terms and in relation to sort of people's everyday lives, I think that that's really attractive to people. And we have to kind of get back into that headspace and not think about fighting for, you know, the few votes that exist in the center. I think we have to think about our movement, how big it can be when it's at its biggest, and aim to your point about percentages. It's not going to be good enough in future elections for us to increase our popular vote count by a couple percentage points. We have to be thinking about 40% popular vote support, which sounds daunting and crazy, but it's not. And the efficiency will follow, right? Once you're in government, I mean, the nice thing for the Liberals is that they can have hyper-targeted Facebook ads about guns, because their vote is so efficient that they're fighting over literally a few hundred votes in a Toronto riding here or there. Well, all they have to do is convince a few dippers to vote for them because they're scared of us on guns. And no matter how unscary Aaron O'Toole seems, the Liberals are really, really good at that. And if we try to play that boutique game from a position of having lost the last few elections, I just don't think it's a winning proposition for us. We need to be thinking in big terms, taking big risks, driving wedges so we're not on the thin end. We're the ones driving the wedge, and thinking about how to unite 40% of Canadians behind big conservative movement issues. And I agree, you know, Danielle and Jordan, I think both made at this point, the only way that works is if we have a pipeline of talent to go out and pitch it to voters. And, you know, it's too late. It's already too late now to be training up the young people who are going to become candidates and then MPs and then leadership contestants. We need to be recruiting those people now, and even before there are candidates at the federal level, they need to be our candidates at the municipal level, right? Potentially, or youth leaders or whatever. You know, the work we do now on those people will make them leadership contenders 10 years from now. And the movement, so, you know, there's the short-term requirements of the party, but there's also the long-term requirements of the movement. And, you know, I'll just plug this group. This is the kind of thing we need to do more of. There needs to be more of this. I'm really thrilled at the guys who launched the hub, at the people in the media who launched the line, like 2 new right of center media outlets in the online environment that are driving conversations around our issues. We need more of that, not less, because it's the kind of thing that inspire people to join the broader movement, grow up in it, care about it, and expand it.
And look, Kate, I mean, I love what everybody said, great points. For me, it's simple. It just comes down to numbers, guys. Like 2/3 of the seats are in Quebec and Ontario. How do we speak to Quebecers? There are 30 seats that belong to the Bloc that should be ours. Think about that. There's 30 seats that should be ours. And I know people think the Bloc, if the Bloc wasn't there, the Liberals would have a majority. Of course they would, because we're not talking to Quebecers. We're not speaking proper French to them. You know, let's go back in history. Johnny MacDonald didn't win his mega majority governments because he truly cared about Quebec. He was smart. He made an alliance with Georges Etienne-Cartier and won mega majorities because Georges Etienne-Cartier would speak to Quebecers. We have to be bold again. You know, we need to, does that mean having a second leader that just speaks on the French issues? Who knows? But we know now that the Bloc is weak. We know that Blanchet is arrogant and weakened from this election. And he has 30 seats that we can go get. It comes down to the numbers. All around Montreal, all the ridings around Montreal are small C conservatives if we want to put them on the spectrum. We can go for those seats, but we don't. And same thing with the GTA. That's where all the seats are. Let's speak to folks in the GTA as well. And so it comes down to, are we speaking to people? Forget the issues. Forget the issues. Aaron O'Toole's French was much better. I was genuinely impressed. But at the end of the day, people vote for people who are like them, who, especially if they want to be represented by these people in our capital. We need to have people like Mulroney was successful, not just because of his policies and free trade. He was successful in Quebec because he spoke like a Quebecer, even though he was an Anglophone. And I think it comes down to the numbers. We got to win those seats. And if we don't get creative on how we're going to image and brand ourselves and speak to people, we're not going to pierce the wall in Toronto, and we're not going to win those nationalist seats that we should be winning in Quebec.
So what's the thread? If you could, if there's one issue or idea or theme that will somehow pull together, our new voters in Newfoundland with, people on the outskirts of Quebec City, with somebody living in York Region in Ontario, with somebody who's voted for us consistently, in rural Alberta, and somebody in Richmond, BC. What is that thread? Because we are talking about a very disparate voter coalition that we need to try and appeal to. One thing I would add to that is that's going to get more challenging and not less. We've got electoral or riding redistribution happening again soon, before the next election. It will add more seats to urban centers, not areas that the Conservatives are strong. So ideally, one word from each of you or a couple sentences on what you see that thread being. And Alex, we'll go to you first.
Well, we don't need to run I'm going to say something really controversial, but we don't need to run an actual national campaign. This country is gigantic, and it has multiple nations in it. Quebecers were used to saying that we're a nation. We actually really are. As someone who travels across the country, I can say Quebec is really distinct. But we need to run distinct campaigns in each part of the country. We can't believe naively that one issue is going to carry the election for us across the country. It won't. We have to speak to what people care about locally. In Quebec right now, people really care about the French language. Sure, we've cared about it forever, but especially now, there's a genuine worry, even amongst non-separatists, about the future of the French language. Well, we need to talk about that. In Quebec, nobody cares about that in Toronto. In Toronto, in ridings which are majority new immigrant ridings, how are we talking to those people differently, to their issues? How are we talking to the millennials who will never be able to buy a house, like Ginny was mentioning? We have to run multiple mini campaigns across the country. And when we think about out west, in British Columbia or Alberta, we have to run a distinct campaign there. How do we, you can't talk about you can't have one theme, one thread across this country. And if we think like that, we're just not going to be competitive everywhere. If you try to satisfy everyone, you're going to satisfy no one. We have to run localized campaigns. That's how we're going to be successful.
Danielle, what are your thoughts on that? And then we'll go Jordan, Ginny, and then we need to spend some time talking about the PPC, because we're getting lots of questions coming in on that.
I asked the question, what can each individual do, or what can each business do? I met a woman at an energy conference who said, why don't we have people speaking to Quebec about energy in their own language? So I'm starting French lessons, and I have Michael Binion did the same thing. He wanted to get through on the issue of shale gas development in Quebec. So at 51, he taught himself French. He did an exchange with business leaders coming out here, teaching them about fracking. Like, I don't know why it is we expect that Aaron O'Toole or any leader is supposed to do all the work. It's up to us to try to figure out. It's funny to me that in English Canada, we get frustrated that Quebecers aren't listening to our issues. But guess, are we listening to Quebecers' issues? Are we learning their language so that we can understand what the dialogue that is taking place in Quebec? And the reason I say this is because one of the last shows that I did when I was on the air, I talked to Germaine Belzile, and I said, why is it that we're such a target of Quebec in Alberta, or Alberta is such a target for Quebec? Why is it that Quebecers don't like us? He says, well, it's not that Quebecers don't like you, it's that they don't think about you at all. They're too busy thinking about themselves. And so I think that we've got to do in English Canada a little more proactive outreach to understand, teach the language, teach ourselves the language, develop the partnerships, try to get our business community out there, developing the business ties, doing exchanges. To me, that's really important. And the main message from a political leader is we respect Quebec's autonomy. We respect Alberta's autonomy. We respect every province's autonomy. We're going to make it easier to make sure that each province has the means to take care of their own priorities in their own place. I felt that Stephen Harper was so much stronger on the message of decentralization. And I think that's the only way that you bring Alberta and Quebec together on some of the biggest issues in the country.
Alexander's right. It's not one election. It's 338 elections, 338 little knife fights across the country. And, yes, the leader has an outsized importance in it. But, until we get that into our heads, the Liberals did, for example, the Liberals had 4 candidates of Filipino descent and all running in ridings with strong Filipino populations. 2 of them were no hope ridings. One was kind of on the bubble and one they should win. So what did they do? They did a special town hall for Filipino voters speaking Filipino languages, and did the kind of thing. And guess what? The 2 won, the 2 no hopers lost, but that's a net gain for them, right? And we have to dig into that. Danielle's absolutely right about the message of decentralization, about letting provinces decide. I had this conversation with my wife, who was concerned that the Conservatives were anti-abortion, and I'm like, well, I said, well, the provinces determine healthcare anyways. Who cares? You can say whatever they want. They're not tying funding up on it. Who cares? BC, it's not going to be ever touched. What are you worried about? And those are the kind of messages. We always get stuck with all the negative stuff from the states, from American politics. This is actually one of the positive things. Use the federal campaign should be deflecting to the states constantly. Our federal campaign should be deflecting to provincial autonomy. I like what Alexander has suggested here. So I think there's real merit in that approach.
I don't want to be too aggressive, but we are not just a vehicle for power as Conservatives. That is what Liberals are. And I don't mean that is what progressive voters are. I mean, that is what the Liberal Party is. It is a vehicle for people who don't care about anything to form power. And it's easier, honestly. Their proposition is easier because they can do everything that we were just talking about. They can be all things to all people in every region of the country. They can run 300 and whatever it is, separate campaigns. But, and so we could do that, but then we would just I would highly recommend everyone just join the Liberal Party instead, because they've already won. We have to have, so I agree, retail politics is important, and all these tactics like training and empowering local candidates to appeal in their ridings and try to win with that extra 5 or 10% of the vote that helps you on the org side, close the deal. For sure, we should do that. And we're weak on that, and it's disappointing. But first, we need a conservative framework of why people should vote for us at all, and what our approach would be to government. That is, more ethical and more freedom oriented and more good governance oriented and more focused on patriotism and a values driven foreign policy. I mean, I'll just pause on foreign policy for a minute, right? The entire refrain throughout this campaign was voters don't care about foreign policy. Well, they don't until they do. And we had some really good stuff in our platform, but we didn't spend a ton of time talking about it because we thought, oh, voters don't care about foreign policy. Well, I mean, let's move the center to us a bit. Let's persuade. And if we believe in our movement and being conservative, there's a reason we all join the party. There's a reason we all show up to this thing. There are tons of attendees on this call right now. I think we have to be a bit more bullish about expressing that. And yeah, not on the niche stuff, not on the stuff that we know draws very little support, but on the stuff where, 80% of the stuff we can agree on that has held our party together and allowed us to form a majority government before. We know it exists. And if we, it has to be current, it has to appeal to the big young swaths of voters today in the key areas where we're losing. But I don't think that means it has to be unconservative, and I don't think it means it can't have a national message or a national sort of framework.
So how much or little attention in that regard do conservatives, small c conservatives, need to pay to the movement that is happening towards the People's Party? We've talked quite a bit on this call about the tactics and the voter strategies and the issues and who to go to. And I think you step back from that and you realize that there is something happening within with a movement to that party that is not really about any of those things. Maybe you'll disagree, but it's more of a feeling and a sentiment and a protest and a commentary about government, about Canada's place in the world, about Canadians' place in this country. How much time, little time do we need to be spending, not just thinking about this, but really trying to understand the motivation here. Is this a flash in the pan, motivated and exacerbated by COVID? Is there something bigger here that Conservatives need to be mindful about and actively even engaged in? So Jenny, we'll stick with you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the breakdown, I think it's really easy to overstate this idea, and I think it's a bit lazy, and it sounds like sort of loser talk to say that the PPC spoiled things for the CPC. And I don't want to discount I'm sure there are specific ridings where specific candidates could talk about voters they met who would normally consider voting Conservative but voted PPC instead. I'm sure there are specific cases where that's true. But as a movement that cannibalized our vote, I don't know that the data actually bears it out. You see when pollsters have asked, you see a lot of non-voters voting PPC, you see a lot of former Green voters voting PPC. So it tends to attract the protest movement voters. Having said that, we also need to be attracting non-voters, right? There are liberal Conservative switchers, there are NDP switchers, and then there are non-voters who we can get back to the polls to vote for us. I think when we go into the data, and if you look at some of the breakdowns in the writings I've been looking at, our biggest challenge as Conservatives is the people who didn't show up to vote for us and probably didn't show up to vote at all, and they weren't motivated to the polls. And so there may be something to this idea of people who feel a bit disaffected and feel like none of the institutions in Canada right now are speaking to them, or in fact, or even going further and saying that those institutions are kind of denying their reality and gaslighting them a little bit. And I think there's something there for us as Conservatives to listen to and try to speak to. But I also think that the reason Max Bernier was able to galvanize those voters this time around is very specific to COVID restrictions and the pandemic. And I don't know that that will be true next time around. So I wouldn't bank on if we just fight the restrictions and just fight vaccine mandates that, we'll magically get an extra 5 or 10% of the popular vote. I think that would be a recipe for failure. Having said that, being stronger on fundamental freedoms, one of those things I would add to the list of the stuff that 80% of Conservatives agree on. That sounds to me like it's the kind of thing that would get non-voters and maybe even this time around some PPC voters back into our tent.
Alex, go to you next on that question.
Yeah, look, Ginny is everything she said is 100% correct. And, from a Quebec perspective, a lot of even commentators, but Quebecers were shocked with the PPC's results because frankly, and I'm saying this respectfully, even to people who are PPC supporters on this call, Maxime Bernier is really a joke here. And he's not perceived seriously at all by even like fringe Quebecers, like let's say on the right or off the spectrum. He's just generally a joke. And he got clobbered by the CPC in Beauce anyway. So that's a good example, right? If he can't even win Beauce, then it gives you an idea of how the rest of Quebec perceives him. So that was the big shock here, is how strong he was in the rest of the country. And I think as people discover Maxime Bernier, they're going to realize, oh, maybe he's a bit, the more they see him, the more that they're going to dislike him. So I don't think our party should spend any time or energy really focusing on Maxime Bernier. And I think, frankly, the PPC, just to build on Ginny's point, I think the PPC got a lot of support from the Greens and other disenfranchised voters. And that's what we need to look at, right? Right now in Canada, we think the economy is doing great. Sure, there's a bit of inflation. We've forgotten the hundreds of thousands of people that are actually suffering right now. And we're not seeing them in the media. Most people who have corporate positions, we're all virtual now. So it hasn't really affected our business or our lives. But hundreds of thousands and millions of people are frustrated, are going to suffer getting out of COVID, even if the pandemic ends. And as we prepare for the next cycle, we shouldn't look at them as PPC supporters. We have to look at them as Canadians that are suffering, and how do we respond to that through policy? And also, how do we communicate to them? And I get back to my main point, which is image, the importance of culture and image. How do we actually communicate to those people who are suffering? Not because they're PPC supporters, because they're Canadians who need our help. That's how we have to look at the PPC.
Danielle, what's your perspective?
Well, I have a soft spot for Maxime Bernier from back in his days when he was with the Montreal Economic Institute. And I am far more libertarian probably than most of where the Conservative Party is at right now. But I would say, his votes came from somewhere. Maybe there's some polling that needs to be done to understand who it is he attracted and who he pulled from. There's probably some polling that needs to be done about some of the new voters for the Conservatives, because I think there was a lot of movement that occurred. The Greens collapsed and their movement probably went NDP, and then the NDP went Liberal, and some of the Liberals went to Aaron O'Toole, and then Aaron O'Toole's vote went to Maxime Bernier, because it can't be otherwise, because he ended up with the same vote that Andrew Scheer got last time around. So there is some movement that is occurring, and I think we need to understand why. I think in future, having this freedom message could also work with the decentralization message, because quite frankly, the issues that animate me are not at the federal level at all. I care about healthcare, education, senior services, daycare, how you address all those issues. And those are not issues that I want being managed from Ottawa. So I think that there's probably some combination of being the party of free speech and free assembly and freedom of religion, freedom of choice in healthcare decisions. I don't know that we're able to move to that yet, because everybody is still kind of in the crisis of COVID. But I think that is potentially, as we get past COVID, going to be a more and more important part of the movement. I think Aaron O'Toole had a bit of a tough row to hoe on this one, because the Conservative movement is split on this. And it's not, I don't think it's just conservative libertarian. I think it's urban rural. I live in a rural area. And so I can tell you the world is very, very different from High River than it is in Calgary. And I don't know that we've really mapped out why it is rural and urban are so different, where the common cause might be. But the people I talk to have the perspective that basically the election is now decided by Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, and Edmonton. And that leaves a lot of the country feeling unrepresented. So I don't know how to bridge that divide, but perhaps decentralization and freedom might be the foundation for how to build that.
Just before I go to Jordan, how do we square that appeal for, freedom, decentralization with voters who, through their electoral choices, appear to be more in favor of interventionist government, more in favor of, that type of involvement from the state in their lives? I'm taking everybody's point in terms of, the piece that may bridge PPC to CPC being that support for fundamental freedoms and personal choice. How do we square that with the reality that 80% of the population supports vaccine mandates, for example? Like it or not, a press gallery and a media that are very much willing to show that wedge and kind of highlight how different conservatives feel about this issue than perhaps the rest of the country. I completely agree with what you're saying. I'm just pointing out the reality of where that could lead us, and if maybe that jeopardizes us with other voters.
Yeah, I'll come to that in a second. Just to close off Danielle's point, I can assure you no one in Vancouver feels like we're affecting the election in any way. Most of the time, the elections are already called by the time polls close in British Columbia. So don't lump us in as that we think that we have any effect on it whatsoever. On the protest vote movement, it might be worth looking a little bit at Vancouver Island. There hasn't been a Liberal elected in Vancouver Island, I think, since David Anderson in the early 2000s. Their votes are classic protest votes. They go from the used to go from the Reform Party, and then after the Reform Party disappeared, they went to the Greens. There is just that group of people who are always going to be contrarian. On vaccines and that part of the PPC, I think that becomes less relevant to the next election. If it is 18 to 24 months down the road, I don't think vaccinations will be as big a deal. The question then will be more about the economic fallout of years of interventionist federal government propping up or pretending to prop up huge swaths of the economy. It'll be about government workers being in much better fiscal shape than private sector workers. It'll be about the loss of entrepreneurs and small businesses and communities. And those are our kind of messages, right? Like, let's fight on that territory. That to me makes a lot more sense. So there's pendulums, right? Like, we talk like we've never ever won an election before. Well, Stephen Harper, I remember him. We can say his name. Stephen Harper existed, and he did win, and he won in suburban riding. These things go back and forth, and we're just in that dark moment right now. But you know, I have to believe that there is light coming if we just look at it.
I think that's right. And I think we have to, you know, I wrote a column for the National Post a number of months ago, which Troy would have hated, about how we shouldn't talk about debt and deficit, at least not in those terms, because there's no public appetite for it. But we should talk about inflation, right? Like there are sound fiscal management issues that just because there's sort of a populist global movement against austerity, that doesn't mean that we can't, as conservatives, talk about those issues through our own frame. And when we talk about cost of living, and when we talk about sound fiscal management, examples of waste, I think all those things bring those issues home for our core voters, and sort of rallying people around our party in a way that we may have lost. And I think when we look at our issue set and say, oh, well, those are big losers when you poll on them, and so we give up on them and we try to talk about the liberal issue set instead, we're going to lose every time because they're better at it than we are, and we don't believe it, right? If we look at our issue set and it's not you know, at the top of the list of issues that pollsters say Canadians care about, we have to make Canadians care about it. And that's not by talking to them with messaging they don't care about. It's about finding a conservative way of describing, or a way that is relevant to people and resonates with people, of describing conservative approaches to government and issues. And I think that's true for the sort of post-vaccine recovery, or the post-COVID recovery era as well.
And Kate, I just want to build on what Ginny just said, and I know we have only like 2-3 minutes left, but I'll give a really concrete example to all the listeners. National childcare. So the Liberals come out with this great vision about national childcare. This was even before the election. They sign a deal with the provinces, right? What do we respond with? A tax credit. Like, honestly, a tax credit. And as somebody who has an 8-month-old and who's going through the process of maybe finding a daycare spot in our amazing Quebec national daycare system, like, why didn't we think more and push more on that envelope? For example, the national daycare system is only going to be up and running in 5-6 years. It's ridiculous. My kid's going to be 6 years old. He won't even be in daycare anymore at that point. I'm in Quebec, but let's say you're outside of Quebec. It's ridiculous. Like, why didn't we come out strong and say, okay, well, look, we'll do it in 2 because we're actually conservatives and we can actually get shit done. You know, being bold. I'm so fed up. And sorry, this is the kind of stuff that really irritates me. We are not selling vision to people. That's what people want from our party. And to get back to Ginny's point about, you know, it's not about fiscal responsibility. No one cares anymore about that. Sure, we should, a little more than Trudeau, but people buy vision. People want to know that you're going to transform their life. The tax credit won't.
I guess just to respond to that about how that wouldn't sell in Alberta, people want to have perhaps a one-parent working household and one parent staying home. And so I don't know that you can have a one-size-fits-all national program. I think it was noted in Alberta that Quebec was able to get a $6 billion transfer. And we asked for the same thing, say, hey, we'll do our program our own way. And we were told no. So I think the binding message still is going back to decentralization, because I don't know that we're going to be able to weave a policy on some of these social issues that can sell in both Quebec and Alberta.
Okay, we've got 1 minute left, and I want to end on a positive and forward-looking parting thought from each of you, answering the question, you know, what is the consideration that the movement needs to have right now? We're coming out of this campaign. We've got a little bit of time to be thinking and preparing for the next one. As conservatives, what is the big consideration of the question that we need to answer right now? Danielle, I'll stick with you.
Well, I would say give Aaron O'Toole a chance. I know that there have been some questions that came in beforehand saying, let's put another knife in the back of our leader. We do this all the time. We think that some kind of perfection is just around the corner, and he ran a pretty decent campaign. He hit a lot of the right notes. He got, I think he was pretty error-free. So just give him a chance now that people know and are paying attention to see if 18 months from now, when we are post-COVID, I remain hopeful that we will be post-COVID at some point. I see some of the chatters don't think that we will, but that's when we have to deal with the consequences of the decisions that we collectively have made. And this is actually a good period. And Justin Trudeau is going to have to wear all of the decisions, and then Erin O'Toole 18 months from now can come in as the savior. So I think we just need to be patient and stay focused on that fiscal message. At some point, people will come around to realizing that that's what the next step needs to be.
Let's go Jordan, Alex, and then Jenny to close.
Billy Graham used to say that in order to contextualize his faith, he needed to be anchored to the rock, but geared to the times. And for the conservative movement, we need to be anchored to the rock principles that define who we are and our vision of the world. But we need to certainly gear our message to the times, the generations that we're reaching out to. So if you remember one thing from this, remember anchored to the rock and geared to the times, because we do one very well, the other we're not. The other we need some improvement in.
Absolutely. And the reality is, even if we change leader, nothing's going to change, guys. Nothing. And when we think about the next election cycle, it's not about the leader. It's what are we proposing to Canadians? And from an image perspective, also in policy, that's what we have to look at. And changing Erin won't do anything. Erin is a solid candidate. For the record, I wasn't on the campaign or anything. I'm a full-on outsider. And changing the leader is just going to divide us more, waste more money, significant amount of money that we should be deploying to take out the Liberals. And so I hope there's going to be unity in our caucus, our party, and I hope that we're going to focus on what needs to happen, which is focusing on the cities. How do we get into Montreal or near Montreal? How do we get into the Toronto area? How do we get into Vancouver? How do we stay competitive and appeal to urban voters? I hope that's the question that people are going to ask, not how do we take down our leader.
Jenny, final word to you, and then Troy can close us out.
I won't comment on the leadership, but I think that tweaks are not good enough. I think we need big, bold leaps to win. I'm not saying that's easy. And so the best advice I can give is that the movement, we need to strengthen the movement, whether for this leader or the next leader or the leader after that. Organizations like this one need to grow and be stronger. And anyone who cares about the party should invest time and money and effort in right of center media outlets, right of center think tanks, right of center forums, because that's the only way we and training forums, not just on policy and strategy, but also on the tactic of getting organized and winning campaigns. And that's the best thing we can do, not just for next election, but for many elections after that.
And just great point. And one thing I think a positive that I had out of this campaign and looking at the movement was looking at the really great work that right of center media contributed to the ecosystem during this campaign. Lots of extremely thoughtful conversation about issues that conservatives care about. We've needed this for a long time in Canada's media ecosystem, and there are some really great people doing wonderful things. And yeah, I think that we're well positioned in that regard for the future. So over to you, Troy, for final words.
Hey, thank you so much, Kate, and to our panelists for an excellent discussion. And, even the chat was really lively. I was enjoying watching that as well. Lots of opinion from across the country. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Again, this exchange call will be posted to our website and to our YouTube page within the next 2 hours. A reminder of our best practices forum and regional networking conference coming up next week. Again, if you use the code EXCHANGE, there's 25% off the registration. Again, a special thank you to our sponsor, the Modern Miracle Network. We are the Canada Strong and Free Network, and if you appreciate and value the work we're doing, please consider a donation. Thank you, everyone, again, and we'll see you on October's exchange call. Bye for now.